A cleaning lady warned the millionaire not to sign the deal that night. The next day, she found an old family heirloom on her doorstep. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The city sparkled under the glow of holiday lights, but the warmth of Christmas felt worlds away inside Alexander Hayes' corner office. The expansive space, with its sleek glass windows and meticulously curated art, seemed more like a fortress than a place of celebration. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his sharp features illuminated by the cool glow of his laptop screen. He wasn't one to dwell on sentimentality, especially during business. Tonight, his focus was razor-sharp, finalizing a deal to sell an estate his family had owned for generations. His assistant had left hours ago, and the cleaning crew worked quietly in the background. As he reviewed the paperwork, Alexander spoke into his headset, his tone firm. "Yes, we're closing tonight. I want the signatures by midnight. It's just an estate, there's no room for nostalgia in business." His words carried the confidence of a man accustomed to making decisions that shaped fortunes. Nearby, Rosa Martinez worked methodically, wiping down a long marble table. The faint strains of Christmas music from her earbuds hummed in the air, but her attention was drawn to Alexander's voice. Normally, she kept her head down and her thoughts to herself. Yet, tonight felt different. Something about the tone of his conversation made her stomach knot with unease. She hesitated, pretending to adjust her cleaning supplies, but her curiosity compelled her to linger. Alexander clicked off his headset and leaned over the contract, pen in hand. That was when Rosa blurted out the words that surprised them both. "Don't sign that deal tonight." The room seemed to freeze. Alexander turned his head slowly, his brow furrowed. He hadn't even realized she was still in the room, let alone listening. "Excuse me," he said, his tone a mixture of incredulity and irritation. Rosa flushed but stood her ground, clutching the edge of her cleaning cart for courage. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. It's not my place. But I just had a feeling. A bad feeling. Please, don't sign it tonight." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's heating system. Alexander's eyes narrowed as he studied her. She was small and unassuming, dressed in a plain uniform, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She couldn't have known the details of the deal. It was absurd, laughable, even, that she would interject like this. And yet, something in her expression gave him pause. It wasn't just the words, it was the sincerity behind them. "Do you know anything about this deal?" he asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. Rosa shook her head quickly, her hands twisting together nervously. "No, sir. Sometimes, I get these feelings. I can't explain it." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his pen still poised over the paper. The pragmatic side of him wanted to dismiss her outright. But another part, a quieter, more instinctual part, told him to listen. He couldn't remember the last time he'd considered anything other than logic and profit when making a decision. Yet here he was, hesitating because of the words of a cleaning lady he barely knew. He let out a low sigh, setting the pen down. "Thank you for your concern, Ms. Martinez. But I don't make decisions based on feelings." Rosa nodded quickly, her cheeks reddening. "Of course, sir. I'm sorry for speaking out of turn." She hurried back to her cart and resumed her work, scrubbing the same spot on the table to avoid meeting his gaze. Alexander turned back to the contract, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a man who believed in intuition or fate. But as he stared at the signature line, Rosa's words echoed in his mind. He picked up the pen again, then set it down with a frustrated exhale. Instead of signing, he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the twinkling city. His reflection stared back at him, stern and tired. The estate wasn't just a piece of property. It had once been his grandparents' home, the place where he'd spent countless summers as a boy. He hadn't thought about that in years, but now the memories crept in, uninvited. Behind him, Rosa quietly gathered her supplies and wheeled her cart toward the door. She glanced back once, her eyes lingering on Alexander as he stared out into the night. She felt a pang of guilt for overstepping, but also a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he'd listen to her. As the door clicked shut behind her, Alexander turned back to his desk. The pen rested on the contract, untouched. He sank into his chair and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he rubbed his temples. Rosa's warning shouldn't have meant anything to him. And yet, it felt like a thread tugging at the edge of something he couldn't quite unravel. For the first time in years, Alexander decided to let the papers sit. The sun filtered through the towering glass walls of Alexander's office, casting soft beams across his desk. The city below buzzed with the energy of Christmas Eve morning, but inside, the tension hung heavy. Alexander sat in his chair, staring at the unsigned contract that had consumed his thoughts since the night before. The pen rested beside it, as if daring him to pick it up. He had always prided himself on making swift, decisive choices. Yet, Rosa's words still echoed in his mind. He tapped his fingers against the polished wood of his desk, his gaze drifting to the framed photographs on the bookshelf. Among the crisp, professional images of corporate events and awards was a single picture of his grandparents' estate. He remembered summer mornings filled with the scent of fresh-baked bread and the creak of the old porch swing. It wasn't like him to let personal memories cloud his thinking. He was logical, focused, at least, that's what he told himself. Alexander reached for his phone and dialed his assistant, who picked up on the second ring. "I want you to put the Castle Ridge deal on hold," he said abruptly. "We're not signing today." There was a pause. "Sir?" "The investment group is expecting confirmation before noon," she replied, her tone tinged with confusion. "I'm aware," Alexander said curtly. "Tell them I've decided to review the terms again. And get the research team to dig deeper into their background. I want everything we missed the first time." He ended the call without waiting for a response and leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. It wasn't like him to second-guess a deal, but something didn't sit right. Maybe it was Rosa's warning, or maybe it was something he couldn't quite name. His mind wandered back to past deals, moments when he'd ignored gut feelings and paid the price. There had been the tech startup that looked perfect on paper, only to collapse under the weight of unreported debts. Or the real estate project with promises of high returns that had been nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Each time, he'd learned to trust his instincts, even when the data seemed flawless. Still, this felt different. Was he letting the sentimentality of the season influence him? Or was it the memory of Rosa's earnest expression, her voice trembling with both fear and conviction? He shook his head, trying to push the thought aside. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotion dictate his actions. Yet here he was, waiting. Hours passed, the office growing quieter as employees left early for the holiday. Alexander's phone buzzed, and he answered briskly. His research team had news. The investment group has ties to a shell corporation involved in several fraud investigations, the voice on the other end explained. They've been implicated in money laundering and have a history of using properties like the Castle Ridge estate to cover their tracks. If you'd signed, your name would have been directly linked. Alexander's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. How had they missed this during the initial review? He felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that he'd postponed the deal, and frustration that he'd nearly been pulled into something so reckless. Terminate the agreement immediately, he said firmly. Send them a formal notice and ensure we're protected legally. When the call ended, Alexander sat in silence, his mind racing. Rosa's simple warning had been the catalyst for uncovering something much darker. She couldn't have known the details, but her instinct had been right. He glanced at the clock. The morning was slipping away, but he felt an odd sense of clarity. Rosa's words had not only saved him from a disastrous deal but had also forced him to confront something he rarely acknowledged, his tendency to dismiss anything he couldn't quantify. As he stood and grabbed his coat, Alexander decided he owed Rosa more than a passing thought. The deal was over, but the day wasn't, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. Rosa awoke to the soft hum of life stirring outside her small apartment. It was Christmas morning, and though the world was wrapped in festive cheer, Rosa's reality was less rosy. Bills had piled up on the corner of the kitchen counter, her paycheck barely stretched to cover necessities, and the holidays always seemed to magnify the little cracks in her life. Still, she held on to hope, as she always did. When she opened the door to retrieve her morning paper, she froze. Sitting on her weathered welcome mat was a small box, perfectly wrapped in gold foil with a red velvet bow. She glanced up and down the hallway but saw no sign of anyone who might have left it. Her heart raced as she picked up the box, her fingers trembling slightly. It was light but felt expensive, as though whatever lay inside wasn't meant for someone like her. Rosa closed the door behind her and set the box carefully on her kitchen table. For a moment, she hesitated, as though opening it might shatter the spell of its mystery. Then, curiosity got the better of her. She tugged the ribbon loose and peeled back the shimmering paper. Inside was a velvet jewelry box. Her breath caught as she lifted the lid to reveal a bracelet unlike anything she'd ever seen. The delicate piece gleamed under the light, each link adorned with tiny stones that sparkled like stars. An intricate engraving ran along its surface, something she couldn't quite make out but felt certain held significance. Her first thought was of Alexander. It had to be from him. Who else would send her something so extravagant? After all, she had spoken up about the deal, and he had seemed different afterward. The memory of his face as she left his office flickered in her mind. Could this be his way of saying thank you? Rosa's emotions swirled as she ran her fingers over the cool metal. Gratitude mixed with disbelief, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Her intuition, often dismissed by others, and sometimes even herself, had made a difference. She had risked stepping out of her comfort zone, and maybe, just maybe, it had mattered to someone as important as Alexander Hayes. Without a second thought, she grabbed her phone and dialed her sister. "Anna, you won't believe this," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. She described the bracelet in vivid detail, laughing as her sister gasped on the other end of the line. "It's beautiful, Anna. I don't know why he sent it, but it feels like... I don't know, like a little miracle." Anna, always the practical one, hesitated. "Do you think it's real?" "I mean, something like that could be worth a lot, Rosa. If it is, you could sell it. Imagine what we could do with that money for the family. New coats for the kids, a real Christmas dinner." Rosa's excitement dimmed slightly as she considered Anna's words. It hadn't occurred to her to sell the bracelet, but now the idea took root. A piece of jewelry wouldn't change her life, but what it could buy might. Still, a small part of her hesitated. The bracelet felt like more than just a gift, it felt like a recognition of her worth, something intangible but powerful. As she pondered, her mind drifted to other times when her intuition had guided her. She thought of the time she had pulled her younger brother off the soccer field moments before a freak storm rolled in, or the night she'd stayed late at work and stopped a friend from driving home after too many drinks. These moments weren't grand or life-changing, but they had always reaffirmed her belief that listening to her inner voice mattered. This time, though, her intuition had spoken up in a world far beyond her own. She had never imagined that her small act of courage in Alexander's office could ripple out to something like this. If the bracelet was truly his way of showing gratitude, then maybe she wasn't as invisible as she often felt. The thought gave her a warm sense of pride, but practicality loomed in the background. Rosa decided she would take the bracelet to a local jeweler to have it appraised, not to sell it, not yet, but to understand its value. If it turned out to be as valuable as it appeared, she would make the decision then. She told herself it wasn't just for her family, but for herself too. After all, if her instinct had been right about the deal, it might guide her in this, too. Setting the bracelet carefully back in its box, Rosa looked out the window at the snow beginning to fall. Her life was filled with uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might have the strength to face whatever came next. All because she dared to speak up. The chill of the winter morning nipped at Rosa's cheeks as she pushed open the door to the small jewelry shop nestled on a quiet corner of the city. Inside, the warmth of the space and the faint scent of polish and aged wood wrapped around her like a comforting hug. Glass display cases glittered with rings, necklaces, and brooches, but none of them compared to the ornate bracelet Rosa carried carefully in her purse. She approached the counter where a silver-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from his magnifying glass. "Good morning," Rosa said hesitantly, pulling out the bracelet. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about this piece, its value, maybe?" The jeweler's eyes widened slightly as she placed the bracelet in his hand. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, examining the engraving and the craftsmanship with practiced precision. For a moment, Rosa felt a flicker of pride, as though this beautiful object reflected a small piece of the kindness she'd received. But as the jeweler's expression shifted to something more serious, that pride wavered. "Do you mind leaving this with me for a couple of hours?" he asked, his tone polite but slightly clipped. "I'd like to run a more thorough evaluation." Rosa hesitated, her instincts sparking with a quiet warning. But she nodded, reassuring herself that it was a normal part of the process. "Sure, I guess. I'll come back later." She left the shop, the bell on the door jingling faintly as it closed behind her. Unbeknownst to her, the jeweler picked up the phone almost immediately, his fingers dialing quickly. He wasn't calling a customer or a supplier, he was calling the police. He recognized the bracelet as one of the items stolen in a high-profile estate burglary from months earlier. He couldn't be sure, but it was too significant a lead to ignore. Rosa went about her day, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. By early afternoon, she was back at her cleaning job in the sleek high-rise that housed Alexander Hayes' office. The events of the morning lingered in her mind, but they were quickly pushed aside as she focused on her tasks. She barely noticed Alexander's approach until he spoke. "Ms. Martinez," Alexander's voice broke the rhythm of her work, startling her slightly. She looked up to see him standing nearby, his hands in his pockets. There was something softer in his expression today, perhaps gratitude, or maybe curiosity. "Mr. Hayes," she said quickly, straightening and wiping her hands on a cloth. "Good afternoon. I wanted to thank you," he began, his gaze steady but kind. "For what you said the other night. It made me think twice, and it turns out you were right. That deal would have been a disaster." Rosa blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "You mean, you didn't sign it?" "I didn't," he confirmed. "And thanks to you, we uncovered some pretty serious problems with the group we were about to partner with. I don't usually second-guess myself, but this time I'm glad I did." A flush of warmth spread through Rosa at his words, but before she could respond, a thought surfaced. If Alexander hadn't signed the deal yet, that meant he likely hadn't sent the bracelet either. But then who? Her pulse quickened as she remembered the ornate piece, now sitting in the jeweler's shop, and the assumption she had made. "Thank you," she said awkwardly, forcing a smile. "And thank you for the gift." Alexander frowned slightly, his brow furrowing. "Gift? What gift?" Rosa's heart sank. "The bracelet," she said, her voice faltering. "The one you sent to my apartment. I thought it was a thank you." For a moment, Alexander looked genuinely perplexed. "I didn't send you a bracelet," he said slowly. "Are you sure it wasn't from someone else?" Her face grew hot as embarrassment washed over her. I must have made a mistake," she stammered, stepping back slightly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to assume." Alexander held up a hand to stop her, his expression shifting from confusion to curiosity. "Rosa, wait. If I didn't send it, who did? And why?" Rosa bit her lip, her mind racing. She had no answers, only more questions. The bracelet had seemed like such a kind gesture, but now it carried an air of uncertainty that unsettled her. "I should go," she said quickly, backing away. "I have work to finish." Before Alexander could press further, she hurried out of the room, her pulse pounding in her ears. She felt foolish for assuming the bracelet was his gift, but more than that, she felt uneasy. If it hadn't come from him, then its presence on her doorstep felt far less magical and far more suspicious. Alexander watched her leave, his mind turning over the strange exchange. Something wasn't adding up. Rosa didn't seem like the type to make wild assumptions, and the look on her face when he denied sending the bracelet was genuine. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, but rather the beginning of something far more complex. Rosa's breath fogged in the cold evening air as she climbed the steps to her apartment building, the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. The encounter with Alexander had left her rattled, and though she tried to push it from her mind, the unease lingered. She clutched her coat tightly around herself, willing the warmth to reach her thoughts. All she wanted now was the comfort of her tiny home and perhaps a call with her sister to find some clarity. The moment she unlocked her door, there was a loud knock behind her. Startled, Rosa turned to find two uniformed police officers standing in the dimly lit hallway. Their presence filled the space with an intimidating gravity that immediately set her on edge. "Rosa Martinez?" one of the officers asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "Yes," she replied cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'd like to speak with you regarding a piece of jewelry you brought to a jeweler earlier today," the second officer said, stepping forward. "May we come in?" Rosa hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. She nodded reluctantly and opened the door wider, stepping aside as the officers entered. Her small living room felt even smaller with them standing there, their serious expressions casting a shadow over the holiday decorations she'd hung with such care. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. The first officer glanced at his partner before speaking. "The bracelet you brought to the jeweler matches the description of an item reported stolen from a high-profile estate burglary earlier this year. We need to ask you some questions about how you came into possession of it." Rosa's stomach dropped. The air seemed to leave the room all at once, and her hands gripped the back of a chair for support. "Stolen?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. I didn't steal it. I found it on my doorstep. It was a gift." At least, I thought it was. The officers exchanged a look, their skepticism clear. We're going to need you to come with us to the station to provide a statement, the second officer said. Panic surged through Rosa, and she shook her head instinctively. I didn't do anything wrong, she insisted, her voice breaking. I didn't know. This isn't an arrest, the first officer interjected gently but firmly. But we do need to clarify the situation, and that will require your cooperation. Rosa's heart pounded as she realized she had no choice. Trembling, she grabbed her coat and followed the officers out of the building, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. How could this have happened? The bracelet had seemed like a blessing, but now it felt like a trap. At the station, the sterile, fluorescent-lit room did nothing to calm her nerves. She sat across from the officers, her hands fidgeting in her lap as they began their questions. Ms. Martinez, one of them started, can you tell us exactly how you came to have the bracelet? Rosa recounted the story as best as she could, starting with finding the package on her doorstep that morning. Her voice wavered as she explained how she'd assumed it was a gift, even mentioning her conversation with Alexander Hayes, though she left out the more emotional details. The officers listened intently but exchanged skeptical glances throughout her explanation. Ms. Martinez, you're telling us that someone left a valuable, stolen piece of jewelry on your doorstep, and you didn't think to question where it came from? One of them asked, his tone edged with doubt. I didn't know it was stolen. Rosa exclaimed, her voice rising with desperation. I thought it was a thank you gift from my boss. He's the CEO I mentioned. He didn't send it, but I didn't find that out until later. The officers leaned back, their expressions unreadable. You mentioned this Alexander Hayes. What connection does he have to the bracelet? Rosa hesitated, realizing how complicated it all sounded. He doesn't, she said finally. At least, I don't think he does. It's just, there was this deal he was about to sign. I said something that made him reconsider, and he thanked me for it. I thought the bracelet was his way of showing appreciation. The officers exchanged another look, this one less skeptical and more thoughtful. The estate this bracelet was stolen from was tied to the very deal you're referencing, one of them said. If Mr. Hayes is involved, we'll need to speak with him to confirm your story. Rosa's heart sank. She had already felt humiliated enough after her awkward conversation with Alexander, and now the police were dragging him into this nightmare. But she had no choice but to nod. He'll tell you the truth, she said quietly. I didn't do anything wrong. The officers left the room briefly, leaving Rosa alone with her thoughts. The walls seemed to close in on her as her mind replayed every decision she'd made since finding the bracelet. She felt small and powerless, like the world had suddenly turned against her. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. She couldn't fall apart now. When the officers returned, they informed her that they'd reached out to Alexander Hayes for verification. Rosa's stomach churned at the thought of him being dragged into this, but she clung to the hope that his word would clear her name. She sat in silence, waiting for the storm to pass, though she had no idea what the aftermath would look like. Alexander was midway through reviewing a set of financial reports when his assistant knocked softly and stepped inside, her expression unusually tense. Sir, there's a Detective Parker on the phone. He says it's urgent. Setting down the documents, Alexander raised an eyebrow. He wasn't accustomed to police calls. Put him through, he said, his voice calm despite his curiosity. When the detective came on the line, his tone was polite but firm. Mr. Hayes, we're investigating a matter involving one of your employees, a Ms. Rosa Martinez. She claims you might be able to corroborate her account regarding a piece of jewelry tied to a recent estate burglary. Alexander sat up straighter, his mind instantly replaying the strange interaction with Rosa earlier that day. Rosa? She mentioned a bracelet earlier, but I'm afraid I didn't send it, he said carefully. What exactly is going on? The detective explained how Rosa had brought the bracelet to a jeweler, who then identified it as stolen. He outlined the connection to the Castle Ridge estate, a property linked to the now-cancelled deal Alexander had almost signed. As the detective spoke, the pieces began to fall into place. The shady group behind the deal, the stolen items, the unexpected gift, it was all too coincidental. Detective, I can confirm that Ms. Martinez has no involvement in any criminal activity, Alexander said firmly. She's an honest, hard-working employee who brought up concerns about a deal I was pursuing. Her intuition led me to discover that the group involved was operating illegally. I can provide you with the documentation to prove it. The detective paused. We'd appreciate that, Mr. Hayes. It would go a long way toward clearing her name. Send me your email, Alexander replied, already opening his laptop. I'll forward everything immediately. And for what it's worth, Rosa isn't the type to get involved in anything underhanded. If she's caught up in this, it's because someone else put her there. After hanging up, Alexander wasted no time compiling the relevant records. The shady investment group had ties to numerous unethical operations, and the evidence was damning. As he sent the files, his thoughts turned to Rosa. He couldn't shake the image of her flustered expression when she'd thanked him for the bracelet, nor the vulnerability in her eyes as she tried to explain herself. She didn't deserve this. Meanwhile, at the police station, Rosa sat in the small interrogation room, her nerves stretched to their limit. She had been cooperative, answering every question with as much clarity as her frazzled mind could muster, but the officer's skepticism was draining her. She felt trapped, as though no matter what she said, they didn't fully believe her. The humiliation stung as much as the fear. The door opened, and one of the officers stepped inside, his expression softer than before. Ms. Martinez, we've spoken to Mr. Hayes, and he's provided records that corroborate your account. It seems the bracelet's connection to the estate was coincidental, tied to a fraudulent group involved in a deal he recently terminated. You're free to go. Rosa's breath hitched, relief washing over her like a wave. You believe me? She asked, her voice shaking. The officer nodded. We do. But you should know this was a close call. Whoever left that bracelet on your doorstep either didn't know its origin, or they knew exactly what they were doing. The words chilled her, and though the immediate danger was over, a deep unease settled in her chest. Who had sent the bracelet? And why had it landed on her doorstep? She wanted answers, but for now, she was simply grateful to be going home. When Rosa stepped out of the station, the cold night air stung her face, but she welcomed it. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The thought of being accused, of being framed, had shaken her to her core. Yet amid the fear, she felt a flicker of gratitude toward Alexander. He didn't owe her anything, but he had stood up for her when it mattered most. Back in her apartment, Rosa sank onto the couch, letting her body sink into the worn cushions. Her mind replayed the day's events, the relief of being cleared mixing with the lingering anxiety of how close she'd come to disaster. She glanced at her small Christmas tree, the colorful lights twinkling softly, and for the first time, they felt comforting instead of mocking. She wasn't entirely sure how she'd find closure, but she knew one thing: she couldn't ignore the mystery of the bracelet. Alexander sat at his desk, his gaze drifting to the faint snowfall outside his window. The events of the past week lingered in his thoughts, particularly Rosa. Her courage in speaking up about the deal had saved him from making a disastrous mistake, but the fallout she'd endured had been unfair. The more he thought about it, the more he felt compelled to do something to express his gratitude and apologize for the trouble she'd faced because of his business dealings. After a moment's deliberation, he picked up the phone and called his assistant, instructing her to arrange a special delivery. "Make it thoughtful," he said. "Something festive. A Christmas basket with nice treats, chocolates, baked goods, maybe some cider. Nothing over the top, but it should feel personal." He paused, then added, "Include a note. Something simple. Thank you for your courage and insight. Wishing you a wonderful Christmas, Alexander Hayes." Satisfied, he ended the call, imagining Rosa's surprise when she found the basket on her doorstep. Early the next morning, as the city stirred to life under a blanket of fresh snow, Rosa opened her door to retrieve her newspaper. Her eyes widened as she spotted the elegantly wrapped basket sitting on her doorstep. It was large and festive, tied with a gold ribbon that sparkled in the morning light. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she simply stared at it, unsure of what to think. Her pulse quickened as she bent down to inspect it. The package was undeniably beautiful, but its sudden appearance triggered an all-too-familiar unease. Memories of the bracelet and the ordeal that followed came rushing back. Who had left it? Why? There was no note in sight, just the festive wrapping and an air of mystery that set her nerves on edge. Rosa's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another scheme from the same people tied to the stolen bracelet? Were they trying to scare her or lure her into another trap? Her heart pounded as paranoia took hold. She scanned the hallway nervously, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, watching her reaction. She grabbed the basket hesitantly, carrying it inside and locking the door behind her. Placing it on the kitchen table, she stepped back as though it might suddenly reveal something sinister. The festive wrapping and cheerful bow seemed almost mocking now, their brightness at odds with the dread building in her chest. Her thoughts spiraled. What if this was another attempt to frame her? The police had believed her innocence the first time, but what if they didn't now? What if the people behind the shady deal wanted revenge for her unintentional role in exposing them? Rosa wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her breathing. She paced the small apartment, glancing at the basket on the table every few moments. The fear was overwhelming, and she didn't know what to do. She couldn't call the police again, not over something like this. They would think she was paranoid, or worse, that she was making up excuses to cover for something. She thought about calling Alexander but dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it came. She couldn't involve him in her paranoia after everything he'd already done to clear her name. As the minutes ticked by, Rosa's panic deepened. Every sound in the apartment seemed louder, every creak of the floor or hum of the radiator magnified by her fear. She sat on the couch, staring at the basket across the room. It looked harmless enough, but the fear of what it might represent kept her frozen in place. She felt trapped in her own home, unable to think clearly or make a decision. Rosa pressed her hands to her temples, her mind racing in circles. She didn't know who to trust or where to turn. The world outside seemed to shrink, leaving her alone with her growing panic. Time dragged on as she remained locked in her apartment, unable to shake the feeling that her life had become a magnet for chaos she couldn't control. Rosa sat on the edge of her couch, the gift basket still sitting untouched on the kitchen table. Her mind churned with anxiety, replaying every terrifying possibility over and over. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Clutching her phone with trembling hands, she scrolled to Alexander's number. Her finger hovered for a moment, her nerves jangling, but she pressed the call button before she could second-guess herself. The line barely rang twice before Alexander's calm, steady voice answered. "Rosa? Is everything all right?" She didn't even register his tone. Words poured out of her, fast and frantic. Mr. Hayes, I don't know what to do. There's another package, a big one this time, sitting on my doorstep this morning. It's wrapped all fancy, like someone really put effort into it, but that just makes it worse, doesn't it? Who would send something like that to me after everything that's already happened? And I don't know why they're still targeting me. It has to be them, right? The same people connected to that awful deal. They know where I live, and they're trying to scare me or set me up again. It's like they want to make sure I can't ever feel safe. Rosa, Alexander started to interject, but she steamrolled over his attempt. And I don't even know what's in it. I didn't open it this time because who knows what it could be? It looks like some kind of basket, but it's huge. What if there's something dangerous inside? Or something incriminating? They could be trying to frame me all over again. Or worse, they're trying to send a message, to warn me to stay quiet about what I know. Not that I even know anything, I don't. But they probably think I do because I was involved in that deal falling apart, even though I had nothing to do with the business part of it. Oh no. Rosa, Alexander tried again, his voice louder this time, but she kept talking, the words tumbling out like water spilling over a dam. And what if the police don't believe me this time? They cleared me before, but that's only because you vouched for me. What if they think I'm making it all up now? I can't go back to the station, Mr. Hayes. I can't handle it again. I don't know who else to turn to, but you've been so kind, and I don't want to keep bothering you with this, but... Rosa. Alexander finally interrupted, his voice firm yet kind. She stopped mid-sentence, startled into silence. For a moment, the line was quiet except for her shallow breathing. Then, to her astonishment, Alexander began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle but quickly grew into something full and warm, his amusement clear as day. Rosa froze, her mouth half open, unsure of what to say. His laughter filled her ears, light and genuine, and completely at odds with the panic she'd been spiraling into moments before. I'm sorry, he said between laughs, his tone apologetic but still laced with humor. I don't mean to laugh, but you have no idea how off the mark you are about this package. What do you mean? Rosa managed to stammer, but her question would have to wait. Alexander was still chuckling. Rosa sat stiffly on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, her heart still racing. Alexander's laughter echoed over the line, and for a moment, she couldn't quite process it. Was he laughing at her? She opened her mouth to protest, but his chuckle only deepened, and soon his voice broke through the static in her mind. Rosa, he said, his tone warm and amused, the basket is from me. The words hung in the air for a moment as her brain scrambled to catch up. What? She said finally, the single word drenched in disbelief. I sent it, Alexander repeated, his voice still carrying traces of his earlier laughter. It's a Christmas gift. Nothing sinister, nothing dangerous, just some treats to thank you and, well, to apologize for everything you went through because of me. Rosa's cheeks burned, a mix of embarrassment and relief washing over her. You sent it, she repeated, almost as though saying it out loud would make it sink in faster. She glanced over at the basket on her table, the gold ribbon now looking far less ominous. Oh my gosh. I thought it was them. I thought it was another setup or some kind of threat. Alexander laughed again, a soft and genuine sound that Rosa found herself begrudgingly drawn to. A threat made of chocolates and cider, he teased lightly. I'll admit, it's an unconventional approach. Rosa groaned, dropping her head into her free hand. I can't believe this, she muttered, more to herself than to him. I was so convinced. I even panicked and locked the door like that was going to stop a basket. Well, Alexander said, a hint of a smile in his voice, at least you're thorough. But I have to ask, did you even open it? No. Rosa exclaimed, mortified all over again. I was too busy freaking out about what it might mean. Rosa, Alexander said gently, though there was still a playful lilt to his tone, next time you find a package on your doorstep, maybe check for a card before assuming the worst. She let out a laugh, the sound surprising even herself. You're right, she admitted, shaking her head. I've officially reached a new level of overthinking. You've had a lot thrown at you recently, he said, his voice softening. Anyone in your position might have reacted the same way. Somehow, I doubt that, she replied, though her tone was light now, the weight of her earlier panic finally beginning to lift. But thank you, for the gift and for not thinking I'm completely insane. Insane? No, Alexander said, his voice full of humor. Overzealous detective skills? Maybe. Rosa laughed again, the sound bubbling up naturally this time. I guess my career as an amateur sleuth isn't off to a great start. Well, you did uncover a shady business deal, he pointed out. I'd say you're at least batting .500. She smiled, settling back against the couch as the tension continued to fade. Still, I think I'll stick to cleaning. Less pressure. Their conversation shifted easily now, the earlier awkwardness replaced with something lighter. Rosa found herself smiling more than she had in days, the warmth in Alexander's voice easing the last traces of her embarrassment. They joked about her detective skills and the basket, with Alexander promising to include a neon sign next time to avoid confusion. I'll admit, Rosa said eventually, I feel a little bad about accusing your gift of being part of an elaborate conspiracy. Alexander chuckled. Just a little? Okay, maybe a lot, she confessed, grinning. But in my defense, you've got to work on your delivery etiquette. Noted, he replied. Next time, I'll make sure the card is prominently displayed. Good idea, she said with mock seriousness. Save us both from another round of mistaken identity. They both laughed then, the sound easy and genuine, as though the stress of the past week had finally started to loosen its grip. For a few moments, Rosa forgot about everything else, the bracelet, the police, the fear that had kept her locked in her own mind. Instead, she focused on the warmth of the moment, the unexpected connection forming between her and Alexander. Thank you again, she said as their laughter faded, her voice soft but sincere. Not just for the basket, but for everything. You've been kind when you didn't have to be, and it means more than I can say. You're welcome, Rosa, Alexander replied. And for what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Rosa felt her cheeks flush, though this time it wasn't from embarrassment. Merry Christmas, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice light with genuine warmth. Merry Christmas, Rosa, he replied, and as their call ended, both of them were left with a little more joy in their hearts than they'd had before.